Okay, so this material I presented already yesterday for the students. Um, they this is the fourth lecture, a series of 6 lectures, and I, uh, I always start with this template. It shows that the Earth is indeed a dissipative heat engine. If you know anything about heat engines, just like steam engines or nuclear power plants, it has a hot reservoir and a cold reservoir, and the energy gets transformed as it passes through, and it runs everything on the Earth. And we talked about that in a prior lecture. And therefore, the human economy, which is entirely embedded in the Earth system, is a dissipative heat engine. And I also define the Earth system as, quote, the world. The world is dynamical and it's changing. It's different than the Earth or the planet. So when people say, um, will this new battery technology save the planet? Well, the planet doesn't need our save. It doesn't need us. It doesn't need our new batteries. And we're not going to be able to save it. But the world is different. The world that we live in is different than the world of the dinosaurs and so forth. And that's what we're changing. We're changing a world from the Holocene into something that it might not be very copacetic for human existence. So we discussed all this, the laws of the universe, evolution of Earth, and we did this so we could see that carbon dioxide is indeed the principal driving factor in the climate of the Earth or any planet like the Earth. Evolution of civilization right up until the current event. The current extinction event has a name. It's the Holocene extinction. There have been 30 extinction events during the Phanerozoic, at least. So only 5 of them are considered, if you will, the major extinction events, but there have been 25, at least 25 others. This is well within the list. Um, and it's rapid. It's faster than most extinction events. Probably all of them, except for when the dinosaurs went extinct in terms of its velocity or speed. And then, of course, climate change. And so now we're going to talk about evolution of our possible futures. This time economics, next time energy, and then part 6 is reserved for solution, space, and discussion. I'm going to pretty much be eviscerate economic discipline, and you might think I'm being unfair since I've never taken an economic course in my life, but I'm cutting the legs out from under it using physics. If you're interested in why it's economically invalid, Steve Keen wrote a 500-page book called Debunking Economics. He's an economist. Kent Kierkegaard is an economist, and he debunks it with Charles Hall, who's an ecologist. Rainer Kummel is a physicist, and he wrote the second law of economics. Adrian Buller is an economist. She wrote The Value of a Will. I'll discuss this later. Andreas Malm is an historian, and Jason Hickel, of course, is an economist. So the criticisms of economics are broad. And I presented this in the very first uh, presentation. There are known knowns if we follow Rumsfeld's definition. There are known knowns, and the only known knowns are things we learn from science. If you think about things that we learn from our heart or our gut or our emotions, well, they're not known knowns. They're opinions. And that includes things like religion and unfortunately economics. The periodic table of elements is a known known, for example. Unknown unknowns, dark matter, dark energy, how proteins fold. I can't give you an example of an unknown unknown today because if I could, it would move into this realm. But but if we go back 500 years, electricity was an unknown unknown. I had no concept that of electricity, and I'm sure there are things we don't know today at all. We have no concept of which in 100 years they'll be aware of. But what the things we know for sure, which just ain't so, is what gets us into trouble, according to Mark Twain. Oh, okay. Do I admit her? I guess I'll just admit her. Hi, Sarah. Um, so these things are the things that get us into trouble. These are things that people believe 10 20% of people believe in a flat earth. I mean, I don't know, 40% believe Trump won the election. I don't know how many. They believe in QAnon. 50% of people deny evolution. They think the earth is less than 10,000 years old. Climate change denial, well, it depends on how you interpret it, but it's either 50% or higher. Holocene extinction denial, I think, I don't know, so I think 50% are in denial, but another 50% are completely unaware. And then, of course, what I introduced, as I said, neoliberal, neoclassical economics is also a fiction. And in fact, Yuval Harari, the historian, also points that out. Much of what we take to be real is fiction. And there's plenty of other things. And this is the stuff that is getting us into trouble. And that's unfortunately how we evolved, I guess. So there are known knowns, the problem. We know the biosphere is collapsing, and we know climate change is true. I'll show that there's endocrine disruptors, forever chemicals and other pollutants in our environment, not inside our own bodies and inside the bodies of our infants. And then all these other things are all true. This is all known problems. And the human economy, 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries have already been breached. So these are ecological and known knowns, the physical laws. These are all thermodynamics. And I mentioned the human economy as a heat engine. Markets do cause inequality. That's been shown by mathematicians and physicists. And the first law of economics, energy conversion and entropy production determine work and all economic output. Okay, so and virtually all economists happen to be energy blind. They don't even have this in their equations. So this is the 6 planetary boundaries that we've breached. You could see there a couple of them are in serious risk, and only 3 are ocean acidification will probably be breached very soon. We pulled back from this. That's proof that we can actually this was breached, but we pulled back. Atmospheric aerosol loading, we may be able to stay underneath the space on that, but we are definitely in serious trouble. And this paper was just published in January this year. I like it as an interesting cartoon, but the authors point out that we're on path B, and we're heading towards biosphere collapse. And there's plenty of evidence for that, which I presented in the last thing. And unfortunately, we have weapons of mass destruction, and humans have a tendency to solve our disagreements violently. So extinction by conflict is definitely a possibility. So if the way we are headed now, we are on path B, we are heading for biosphere collapse. It is collapsing. There's 2 options. We either kill ourselves off or we die back. And die back means billions of people die. The alternative, where we want to go, is global sustainability. And in order to do that, we have to get off path B, and we have to get on track A. And among other things, we have to abandon capitalism. And we have to get rid of economics. We have to rewrite economic principles. So what are the schools of economics? Now, economics is different than science. It's not a science. In science, we have disciplines. So you could be a chemist, or you can be a biologist, or a physicist, or a geologist, or you can be a geochemist or a biophysicist, and so forth and so on. And every science subscribes to those known knowns, the periodic table of elements, Maxwell's equations, lots and lots of things, volumes and volumes of truths, known knowns that science has discovered and all science agrees with. Economics is a class of dysfunctional schools, and economist John Harvey, in his book Contending Perspectives of Economics, describes 8 distinct schools of economic thought. These guys fight each other over basically stuff like are monopolies good or bad? Well, obviously they're not good, but they fight over this, right? I'm including neoliberalism and neoclassical. It's the most popular, it's the most clueless, it's orthodox, and there's nothing in this that's relevant to our survival. And that pretty much obtains to Marxism and these others. I've heard of and read about all these others and read into them, but feminism is a new one to me. And it's not just about a feminist agenda. It's about all minorities and disadvantaged people. So there's not, I don't know why they call it feminist. It seems like they misnamed it, but of course women are treated poorly. They get paid less for the same work and so forth. We know all that. So there is in some of these there is some truth, but all the truth that's in all these seven is already accommodated or included in ecological economics. And this is the only school which addresses climate change and the ecological crisis and recognizes the limits to growth and overshoot. It's the only school which is entirely consistent with history, science, and reality. And here's a good quote from the economist Edward Fulbright: "Economics is a mess," and you can see what he says about it. Now, he doesn't even mention climate change when he goes through the descriptions of those other schools. I mean, imagine talking about neoclassical economics and not even bringing up the biggest thing that's going to affect the economy and which is climate change and Marxism and Austrian, all these things. He doesn't even mention it. And he wrote this with experts in these particular schools, and not one of them thought to say, "Hey, you got to write about our what we're doing with climate change." They're totally ignorant of this. I mean, some are aware of it, but they haven't assimilated in that reality into their ideology. But he gets to ecological economics, and he talks to two ecological economists who he shared their names with me. And he writes the first sentence in his ecological economics chapters: "The rate at which climate change is occurring, it appears to be accelerating, and that's true. The impact will be significant, widespread, and quite possibly catastrophic." And that's all true. And despite the fact that scientists are nearly unanimous in their contention that climate change is occurring, it is unanimous. It's been unanimous at least since 1988, as I'll show. The economics discipline has contributed very little to this conversation. This is true of every school of thought in this volume, which is disturbing given that economic activity is absolutely central to understanding both how the situation emerged and what we must do to address it. Of course, it's not every school. The ecological economics starts with this. It begins and ends with understanding physical reality. So I wrote to Harvey and I said, look, because he tried to defend economics as a science. I said, Harvey or John, I've been writing back and forth. If economics was a science, all economists would be ecological economists by now. I mean, you gravitate toward what works and what's truthful. Neoclassical economics, they're working with the wrong model. The economist Paul Romer, who is a neoclassical economist, he likens it he gave this analogy to the Ptolemaic celestial system, which puts the Earth in the center. And in order to for obviously Mercury never shows up at the right time, and Mars because the Earth isn't in the center, and these are all perfect orbits. And that was because God created the universe in absolute perfection and so forth and so on, and it had to be perfect circles. And when Mars didn't show up at the right place, they added epicycles, and then they had that epicycles over epicycles and so forth and so on. In other words, in order to explain this physically, they just dumped more angels into the mix. Now, Copernicus, by placing the sun in the center of the solar system, actually placed it in the center of the universe. He didn't know that the solar system wasn't the center of the universe. That opened the door for future scientists Kepler, Newton, and Galileo and so forth, the Tycho Brahe, to discover how the solar system really worked. Kepler put his three laws, and Newton developed the law of gravity. You can't come to the law of gravity if you have the wrong model. All you'll do is add more angels. But here you can actually learn some physics, and that's precisely what we did. You have to have the right model. And economists are fundamentally working with a physically impossible model and therefore are blinded to how the economy really works. The model that you'll learn in Economics 101, this is from N. Gregory Mankiw. You can see it's on page 24 and page 504. So you get to 504 pages, you haven't learned a darn thing. This is a closed, isolated thermodynamic system. There's nothing coming in or going out, no energy, there's no oxygen. I don't know, these people are going to die. It's got one state called equilibrium. Goods and services flow this way, money flows this way. That's it. It's a closed, isolated thermodynamic system. It's a perpetual motion machine and assumes money has motive force. It's physically impossible. And yet they teach us when you take Economics 101, this is what you get. Now, this guy, Phillips, was a hydraulic engineer, and Samuelson came up with this in the 40s, and he built this in 1949. It's a hydraulic model of Samuelson circular flow model. And and he has colored liquids for these things. You plug it into the wall and turn on the pump pumps the water and everything goes. And all the economists said, see, Paul Samuelson's model works. But if, like the economy, it only works when you plug it in. If you unplug it, it doesn't work. You need energy. Okay, so this is a more realistic model of economics. It's ecological economics. And we have solar fluxes and we have heat fluxes going out. And they're out of balance now. So we're departing the Holocene and entering an unknown realm. And we have a little geothermal flux. I talked in the previous lecture about the Earth system being the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the cryosphere, and so forth. And then the human economy is embedded in it. It's a dotted line because it's open. It has the boundary, at the boundary, there's lots of flow. So you can study the economy in isolation as long as you have the correct boundary conditions. And of course, that means you have to account for energy and everything else, minerals and materials. Limits to growth had, by contrast to this thing, which has a single state, equilibrium, that had dozens of system states and hundreds of feedback loops. And this was written in punch cards on a computer, on mainframe computers that had less computational power than your toaster oven probably. But it's still it was a great start, and this should have been a paradigm shift for economics. If economics was a science and that they had been paying attention, even though there were some flaws in this, they could have said, well, this is what we have to do to solve economics. We have to start with limits to growth, and we have to throw out all our other crap and start all over again. They didn't have to start completely all over again, but they basically had to accept this as a pretty good reality. By the way, there are no externalities. You have plastics in your body. Uh, um, uh, what economists refer to as externalities means that they're external to the bank accounts of billionaires. There is no such thing as externalities in the human economy. They are in the human economy, the waste. Okay, the first law of economics, this is from Rainer Kummel. Energy conversion and entropy production determine work or economic output, total work. But before you can grow, you have to maintain your system. Now, we're all adults. Hopefully we're finished growing, but we still have to eat every day. And so maintenance is always required because your body and the human economy and everything around you is far from thermodynamic equilibrium. Your car is in your driveway rusting right now. Your bananas on your kitchen counter are rotting. Everything is heading toward equilibrium. And what the human economy is far from equilibrium, right? So you need to do maintenance on your car and so forth, and your house and everything. So economic output equals maintenance first. What economic output is just, and that's not growth. That's just replacing waste. A lot of our economic output is directly to waste, and then finally what's left over is growth. Neoclassical economics have this entirely backwards. They believe energy consumption is a consequence of economic activity, as if the human economic activity spawned the entire universe. these guys are crazy. And I'll show that even they themselves are divorcing themselves from physical reality. I have some quotes. Okay, this is all the evidence you need. Here's energy flow through the human economy is the red. The dots are GDP. It follows, right? This knee in this curve is when we discovered fossil fuels. Now we were growing at a very, very slow rate here because we were discovering better ways to tap into wind and hydraulics, water, and of course we were more efficiently using slaves and animals. And so as we gradually improved our capacity and efficiency in using these things, we were gradually growing. But we were already globalized. We had a global economy since the Bronze Age, as a matter of fact, going back 3,000 years ago and earlier. And we had capitalism and we had slaves, and we'll see all that. And this knee, everything, all the hockey sticks are when we discovered fossil fuels. It's energy flow. Another example, pre-ag growth, the human population was growing about 0.01% per year. Post-agriculture, once we discovered agriculture, we could flow more energy into the human economy, and we were growing by a factor of 10. And post-fossil fuel growth, another factor of 14 per year of growth. And you can see the energy flow, 5, a factor of 4, and another factor of 4. Growth is all about energy flows. Okay. And so economists are energy blind. They don't understand this. And this is why a lot of the books they write are just completely wrong. They just don't understand how to interpret history. John DeLong is an economist. He credits globalization, in the Industrial Revolution and modern corporations for getting us out of what he calls the Malthusian trap and this knee in this curve, which coincidentally is when we discovered fossil fuels or discovered oil. That's his narrative. It's wrong. We were globalized. If you read history, you know that since the 1500s we were shipping. The Portuguese developed a global slave trade, from shipping African slaves to the New World, and then getting rum and whatever, sugar and everything else from the New World, bringing it back, and then taking manufactured goods and sending them to Africa for slaves. I mean, that's a pretty global trade. And they were doing it in wind, and they were doing it in sails, and they were doing it long before this. Okay. What fossil fuels did was put globalization on steroids. The same thing with Industrial Revolution. If you read Andreas Malm's narrative, Fossil Capital, he describes how industrialization was taking place in England, driven by water and wind. Okay, and then of course Václav Smil is an engineer, so you can trust him, and he writes energy, and he's written about 40 books, but this one in particular describes the same narrative as Mal, and the same narrative that is a fact that we were, once we hit fossil fuels, we took off, and a lot of this information comes from Václav Smil. So when the Cobb Douglas, these are two economists in the 20s, their production function, this is production, it equals machines to the alpha power and labor to the 1 minus alpha power. They didn't have this, he didn't have this, or they didn't have this technology thing. So Robert Solow, who in the 50s, who won a Nobel Prize in economics for this, realized that this didn't work. The Cobb Douglas production function. So he added a fudge factory called technology, and he multiplied that against labor. And he fudged it around. He found out this is 85% of the total production. So the whole thing is a kludge. And the reality is technology is part of machines. And so when you have a static model of the economy, you don't understand that machinery changes all the time. The machines we use today are nothing like the machines that were used 20 years ago or in the 1950s or in the 1920s in the Cobb Douglas era. And technology is, so machinery just keeps evolving. In any event, as economist Steve Keen points out, there is no energy term, so it's wrong. Without energy, i.e. food, labor is a corpse, and without energy, capital equipment is a statue. You have to, this lathe isn't going to work unless you plug it in. Okay, so enough bashing on those guys. Now I want to go back to that maintenance. So the Pakistani summer flood, 2022, undoubtedly influenced or caused in large measure by climate change. Um, this is the consequences of those floods. Uh, and, and Pakistan is a poor country, so they had to go to the IMF and the World Bank and beg for money, and they take that money and they can buy materials and energy. And the first things they have to do is replace all this. So they're not going to grow until they rebuild or maintain their economy the way it was. Here's a production directly to waste is bottled water. The cost of water itself is trivial. And at every step along the way, there's profit. And then at the end of the day, they're selling a product that's harmful because these plastics leach into your body and have been associated as endocrine disruptors. Um, and 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 because of capitalism, we can't do anything about this. If we didn't have capitalism, if we were a democratic society with some other kind of system, we could say, look, this is a waste. We shouldn't be doing it, and then call a moratorium and stop it. But you can't do that with Nestle and Coca-Cola because they're just too powerful. And in addition to the economic costs, there's environmental costs as well as with bottled water. And the thing of it is humanity. We don't even actually own the water, but we own it in part with the other species in which we co-evolved, and these guys are selling it back to us at enormous profits. Okay, problem 3 is overdependence on markets. This is what the economists believe. Markets are superior devices for planning. Government should implement and govern through markets, and price signals, innovation, and ingenuity solve problems. It's amusing because most of the economists I've read have no idea what innovation and ingenuity means. And price signals certainly don't signal anything. And so I want to just read this one quote from, because it's very important, from E. David. He was president of Exxon Research in 1982. The critical problem is that the environmental impact of CO2 buildup may be so long delayed. A look at the theory of feedback systems shows that where there is such a long delay, the system breaks down unless there is anticipation built into the loop. And so what markets do is markets are reactive. They react to yesterday's news, Russia invades Ukraine or whatever, and the prices go up or down depending, randomly. The economic, the jobs report and stuff, and then the markets do something, right? So they're reacting. They're not anticipating anything, and they can't. And the problem is that's bad even with any kind of feedback system, because there's always such delays. But in climate, these delays might be decades, many decades and centuries. So we have to anticipate where we will be committed to a climate that we can't survive in long before we actually get there, but long after we can do anything about it. Okay, and notice who this guy works for, president of Exxon Research, 1982. Okay. Okay, all organisms are sensory motor phenomena. At humans, all the way down to slime mold, in fact, trees and plants and so forth. Those of you who are gardeners, you know that. There's sensory components to measure and observe the environment, and motor components to act. And by the way, it involves bacteria and so forth. They all have some mechanisms to sense their environment. Free market capitalism would eliminate all sensory components, which is science-directed governance. In fact, the Republican Party wants to do away with the EPA, which is the only thing that informs us what we're doing in terms of killing whales and everything else. and allow motor components to act indiscriminately. Markets, billionaires, multinational corporations. That's not how your body works. When you get to grab your tea, you're looking for where the glass is, you're reaching with your hand, you're feeling it and stuff. So you have sensory components are interoperating with your motor components. Free market capitalism, like I say, they want to get rid of the sensory components. So there'll be a lot of drunken bums until we just fall off a cliff. Democracies work where there are sufficient checks and balances. This is something the founding fathers realized. They did a poor job with the Supreme Court, as we recognize, but at least they had the idea in place that there should be checks and balances. We are outsourcing our governance and planning to the markets. Nate Higgins is an economist. Milton Friedman, perhaps the most confused economist of the 20th century, and the most influential, which is sad. He said when responding about the limits to growth, you have to separate the economic from the physical point of view. See, I'm telling you that they're off in a fantasy land, economics, and they're ignoring the physical reality. He's admitting it. We don't want to have anything to do with the physical reality. We just want to deal in our little playpen here. Okay, one other thing, pricing do not signal scarcity and they do not signal value. Here's a good example. This is oil market in the last 10 years, from $20 a barrel all the way up to $120 a barrel. It's all over the place. What signal do you get out of this? And the person that put this together, identified some things that are potentially influencing the market, but the market doesn't behave rationally, right? The value of a barrel of oil is exactly the same here as it is here. And because we have a little bit less of it, maybe the prices should have just gradually drifted upward if economists, what they think is true actually was. Limits to growth taught us a bunch of things. Last 50th anniversary, human economy is a dynamical nonlinear system. Okay, it's not that little static, silly perpetual motion machine. You have to model boundary conditions, energy, and material flows. I'm an engineer. When we launched engineering community, it was a great success, the James Webb Space Telescope. That was modeled to death. And the models had to be accurate. They had to be very good. They couldn't be flimsy. They couldn't be ridiculous. They had to be the correct boundary conditions. And you had to model energy and material flows. Okay, there's a full suite of possible futures of which the prevailing belief of exponential growth, unfortunately, is impossible. So this is probability density. You might not be familiar with the term Dirac delta function, but basically neoclassical economists, politicians, bankers, and perhaps like everybody believes in the unrealistic expectation that we can continue growing exponentially forever. That's the one thing that has zero probability of occurring. Now, back in '72, when Limits to Growth was first written, we had the opportunity. A logistic function is where you grow exponentially, you hit an inflection point, and then you start tapering off, and so you get an S curve. That was still possible to have a steady state economy. Herman Daly wrote a book called Steady State Economy back then. Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen was another economist who championed this idea. It was possible, but we were in overshoot now with the 6 planetary boundaries being breached, and so we can't achieve this anymore. We will have a manageable disaster. We will overshoot. We hopefully recover. We will recover, but with a probability that we don't recover in time and we go extinct. There's still a finite probability of extinction, obviously because of our weapons of mass destruction. And there's another probability of, like I said, die off or collapse. Guy McPherson, who's a biologist, believes in a Dirac delta function. He thinks we're already committed to extinction. I personally happen to disagree with him. This is no longer happening, but we can achieve something here. Well, I mean, that's what we have to hope, and that's what we're going to talk about in chapter in the sixth lecture. So markets cause inequality, and inequality has only ever ended badly. We've had markets since before Hammurabi, especially slave markets. Milton Meltzner's Slavery, A World History is a really good book to read in terms of the history of slavery. And Ibram Kendi's book, A Stamp from the Beginning, is another. This is more recent. It's like the last 5 centuries, but he goes all the way back. Walter Scheidel is an historian. He wrote The Great Leveler, and he shows that the only inequality, we always have inequality. We always have markets. We always have inequality. And then we have violence. And either the violence is either a war, um, social unrest, a revolution, or it's environmental, like you know, volcanic activity or whatever, a climate disruption. And that's the only way things get reset, and then we start getting unequal again. So what we have to do, and if any economist who understands economics is taking this serious, like, and there are a few, we have to find a way to end inequality, and we have to do it peacefully. Okay, the yard sale model was a model of the economy written by um, mathematical physicists and applied mathematicians. Anirban Chakraborty proposed it in 2002, and it's been amplified and improved by Boghossian and Turo and many others, all scientists and mathematicians. And it basically shows that if you have a market and you run a simulation with a market, everything being equal, no, everybody has exactly the same amount of wealth at the beginning, and nobody is taller than anybody else, nobody is richer than anybody else, nobody is smarter than anybody else, or dumber, or greedier or anything. It's just all the same. One person ends up with all the wealth in the simulation, always. So market economies, or neoliberal economy, has inequality built into it, and we see that. We look through history, you see that there's always inequality associated with markets. So what do we have in the United States? This is back to 2016. 30% of the wealth in the United States was held by an oligarchy. That's exact same amount of wealth that they held 30%. Oligarchy has as much wealth and power as 94% of Americans. And 38% of Americans in aggregate had no wealth at all. By the way, I confirmed this. This is Boghossian's paper, and I had an exchange of emails with him over a period of time, and he confirmed all this stuff with me, and we had a great, nice discussions. Milton Friedman, the only thing he gets right in his book is the great threat to freedom is the concentration of power, and that's always been the case. Unfortunately, he never read Adam Smith, because Adam Smith points out that monetary wealth is power. This is obvious, right? Peter Thiel bought himself a senator. He owns a senator, J.D. Vance. He owns him outright, and on and on and on. If you have a lot of money, you can have your boy, your worker, call up a senator or a congressman and say, "Hey, can you come to the clubhouse this afternoon? We'll shoot around the golf. I have some things to talk to you about," right? And they'll go. Whereas if you go representing Loudon Climate Project, and you'll probably talk to an intern. Okay, definition of capitalism. Capitalism is this is how they define it, okay? Capitalism is an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. Okay, for the vast stretch of human civilization, the means of production have been labor, and we've had slavery, and that was capitalism. Capitalism is completely compatible with slavery. And the Dred Scott decision, I know you're all familiar with this because you're all Americans. I had to explain this a little bit to my students in India, but the Dred Scott decision did precipitate the Civil War, and Dred Scott was brought from a slave state, Kentucky, into Ohio, which had a law that said you can't own slaves. Dred Scott sued for his freedom. He won all the way up the line to the Ohio Supreme Court, because obviously that's the law. You can't be a slave in Ohio. And they took it to the Supreme Court, the slave owners, and the Supreme Court, the Taney Court. Taney was a slave holder, by the way. That capitalism trumps personal freedom and liberty. Dred Scott is a means of production, he's property, and he has to be remanded back into slavery. His personal freedom and liberty are violated by the rules of capitalism. That precipitated the Civil War. Not, it's not like Northerners weren't prejudiced at the time, and if they had black laws and things like that. But it really irked them that they were perfectly happy if Kentucky and the other southern states had their laws that said you could have slavery, but you can't impose. They didn't want those laws imposed on them. They had the right to have their own laws, and this is what it was doing. It was taking southern laws and applying them into the north, or Kentucky laws and applying them into Ohio. This is why people were willing to fight after the South Carolina, of course, started the war. Okay, so this is important historic and it has consequences. Problem 5, economists claim we can decouple the economy, economic growth from material and energy inputs. And you hear this all the time, all of them, liberals, conservative economists, all of them. They just will insist that, well, if you tell them it's energy and materials, they say, well, we can decouple from that. We can make it finance, or we can cut each other's hair and stuff like that. Well, it's never happened. Here's GDP and here's material footprint. There's zero evidence that you can possibly decouple. It doesn't even make any sense, economic growth without material and energy inputs. But nothing in economics makes sense. Capitalism encourages dishonesty. We saw that with the fossil fuel, lying about climate change. The private for-profit health insurance industry in the United States lying about the efficacy of a single-payer plan. The tobacco lobby lying about secondhand tobacco smoke, and on and on and on. They have to lie to preserve shareholder values or profits. Okay, it rewards greed and promotes people on a psychopath spectrum. Okay. America's top denier, William Happer. He's a consultant, a lobbyist, really, for the fossil fuel industry. Even though he's a PhD physicist, he was President Trump's climate advisor. He gives a 30-minute talk. All his talks are the same. I listened to one. He has 3 references. Only one of those references was substantive. It was a 2001 paper. He's given this talk in 2019, but they still use the same paper, by the way. What Berner and Catavella conclude is, over the long term, there is indeed a correlation between CO2 and paleotemperatures manifest by the atmospheric greenhouse effect. The only paper he has to defend denial, or what he calls skepticism, is a paper that entirely disagrees with him. And this is seriously true. There is no substantive justification for global warming denial. Okay, it's pure denial. There's no skepticism involved. This is the curve they show, and I talk about this in a previous thing, so I'll skip it over today. But if you don't know what I'm talking about here, you can come back to it. ExxonMobil spokesman, again in 1981, Exxon believes the risk of climate change is clear and warrants action. Evidence from 1978. In fact, I just saw evidence from 1954. Okay, in 1988, the greenhouse effect, as a Shell scientist wrote an internal report to their own executives. By the time global warming becomes detectable, it could be too late to take effective countermeasures to reduce the effects or even stabilize the situation. This is exactly what James Hansen testified in 1988 congressional testimony. So we know for a fact that there was zero scientific controversy in human-caused climate change, and at least as late as 1988. The best scientists in the world, climate scientists in the world, and a bunch of climate scientists who work for a shell and are motivated to find something wrong agree 100%. And by the way, it has been detectable for 2 decades or more, and it is indeed too late to reduce the effects. We saw the Pakistan floods, the fires, the record fires in Canada, and on and on and on. So it is too late to reduce the effects, and they'll get worse. But is it too late to stabilize the situation? Well, it may be. Unfortunately, it may already be too late. We don't know. We have to assume and hope that it isn't. But I gave evidence in the last talk that you folks missed, except for Chris, that it may indeed be too late to stabilize the situation. Capitalism has failed us. Climate change is the big lie. It is motivated by greed, capitalism, and neoclassical neoliberal economic ideology. In 1989, the year after, of course, this paper was known to Shell, obviously, and Shell's executives, and Exxon already knew. It wasn't just the fossil fuel industry. The National Chamber of Commerce, DuPont, Dow, Toyota, General Motors, they all joined, virtually every large multinational corporation in the world joined a global climate coalition for the express purpose of lying about climate change. Well, they wouldn't call it lying. I don't know what they would call it. And they had an internal tech report that concluded the potential for a human impact on climate is based on well-established scientific fact and should not be denied. And they've been denying it ever since. They've been funding people like James Inhofe and so forth, and people like William Happer to be lobbyists, and Donald Trump. Okay, bad capitalism dries out good capitalism. Kevin Phillips was a Republican, Undersecretary of Commerce in the Nixon administration, and he became an historian after that. But I don't think he didn't like Reagan, so he has never voted for a Republican since then. But he pointed out in his book, Bad Money, and he's a good historian, and his books are a lot of economists ought to read his books. Bad capitalism drives out good capitalism. So there's the potential, we recognize the potential for good capitalism, but the point is it goes always to the least, to the lowest, the guy in the gutter. If you have, he gives an example, you have 10 honest banks in a community, and an 11th bank moves in, which is shady and cuts corners. They're going to be the ones that make the money. Everybody else is going to have to compete. So bad capitalism is kind of like a virus. It spreads, and everybody has to start lying to protect their profits. Now, I mentioned endocrine disruptors, plastics, pesticides, and other chemical pollution. It's not in our environment. It's in us. It's in polar bears. It's in walruses. It's in everything. All over the world, they find this in the most extreme locations, Antarctica, Arctica, in the Arctic. And it's been in decline. So they have a record of sperm counts because sperm is, it's easy to get. It's not invasive. And so they have a record going back in the 70s. Male sperm counts have been in decline. Around 2000, there was kind of an inflection. It accelerated the decline. And now the average male today has less than 40% of the sperm that a male had in 1970, which means an awful lot of males walking around are infertile. And it's not just the sperm that's in decline, but it's also they're also less mobile and they're dysfunctional. And it's probably the same. The authors of this work, Shanna Swan, is the principal researcher here. We don't have a record of female eggs, but we do have a record of miscarriages and other problems, and just fertility clinics are doing a robust job because people are having a hard time getting pregnant. and and so it's impacting women as well. We just don't have it quantified. And like I say, it's also impacting other mammals, because other mammals are the same as us. And this stuff is in the soils, it's everywhere. And it's plastics, pesticides, and other chemical pollutants. And you don't hear anything about this. There's no signal going to the markets telling them that we got to stop this stuff. Okay, if you want to defend capitalism and you're looking for sucre from Adam Smith, you're not going to find it. Here's a bunch of quotes. I won't read them here. Okay, economics is not a science. If you remember the 2008 credit crisis, the Great Contraction, only 12 economists publishing in mainstream orthodox economic literature correctly forecast 2008 credit crisis. In fact, Nouriel Rubini, who forecast it, was called Dr. Doom. They wouldn't even believe him. And Steve Keen was one of those guys. I say he's the best economist alive today. People object to that, but bloody heck, he got this right. So he's one of 12 best economists. Michael Hudson is another. He's an ecological economist. Michael Hudson is too. I don't know the others. Kurt Rickenbacker was an Austrian economist, and he has died. And they represent a range of economic ideologies from conservative to liberal. I know Rickenbacker was conservative. Keene, Baker, Hudson are liberals. The thing of it is when the economists got this wrong, I have a stink bug here. They convened in Oxford to discuss discuss overhauling the standard economic model. But when they met, and they didn't invite any of these guys, and they met and they decided it was a bunch of Nobel Prize winners and the guy Paul Krugman was there, and decided it only needed tweaking. Instead of realizing they needed to throw it out, it only needed tweaking. And here's the problem: why are we paying economists? What do we need them for? This is their bread and butter. This is what they're supposed to be doing, is warning us about these kinds of things, predicting them ahead of time, telling us what we should do, giving us policies to avoid that kind of stuff. If they can't do that, they literally have no value. And Paul Romer, who is I quoted him before, for more than 3 decades, macroeconomics has gone backwards. I'm sorry, Paul, macroeconomics has been going backwards since the physiocrats in the 18th century. Orthodox economics versus science. So science is self-correcting, where the final arbiter is nature and engineering. And so, scientists discover things. And like I have 50 patents, you know that. And I take advantage of general theory of relativity in 4 or 5 of my patents, because they have to do with timing on synchronization on satellites. And so the fact is that those satellite systems work. So this is confirmation that the science is correct, and in nature too. It's constantly being corrected and improved. And critical thinking or scientific thinking requires one to be willing to be wrong. Otherwise, you don't advance. You don't change. If you're not willing to be wrong, you're already basically rigor mortis to the brain. Orthodox economics, and this applies to any ideology, it's not self-correcting. The 2008 credit crisis taught them nothing. The limits to growth taught them nothing. And while science converges on a truth, like that's why we have thousands and thousands and thousands of truths, like the periodic table of elements, ideology diverges. So we start out, I hate to say this about religion, but we start out with Jesus and his 12 disciples, and one little religion of a couple of little people, and now there's 40,000 Christian sects. It diverges. And some of these sects have gone to war historically against each other. Same thing with every other religion. Okay, and the same thing with economics. These guys are arguing with each other over nothing. By definition, all ideologues are unwilling to be wrong. That's definition of ideology. Now, I mentioned Adrian Buller's book, Value of a Whale, and this really upset me. I mean, this I found disgusting. She opens with a bunch of economists trying to decide the value of a whale. So they cite the economic value of ecotourism and the amount of CO2 of our CO2 emissions a whale might be able to sequester. It's all about us. There's no relationship to what a whale means to the world, to the environment. Anyway, they decided $2 million per large whale. Now, from the world's perspective, large whales are invaluable to the ecosystem and the biosphere that we live in today. And I'll show why, amongst many, many, many reasons. They're part of the biosphere, an important link. To the world, economists have absolutely no value at all. You could take all those economists, put them on Elon Musk's rocket ship, send them to Mars, and the world would be perfectly happy. It wouldn't miss them at all. Okay, even to humanity, a group of experts who cannot foresee the greatest economic crisis in our so far this century, how valuable are they? How useful are they? Okay, they're not. Okay, so here's the next chart. Just to show what we else do. So from the last talk I gave, there've been this is the fourth extinction event which is caused by a single species. There have been three others before at least, and two of them moss and trees when they discovered how to make grow roots. Accelerated the erosion and weathering of nutrients from the land and into the water. They cause eutrophication and anoxia. It's exactly what we're doing in the Gulf of Mexico. There's an anoxic or a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico the size of New Jersey. There's 500 dead zones around the world, and it's caused by our farming because we're putting all this nutrients into and accelerating the nutrient cycle into the oceans. What prior to what we're doing, and once during the Holocene and even beyond, but all during the Cenozoic, animals recycle backwards. There's a feedback going back, a pump. It's a biological pump that takes the nutrients as they get into the ocean and bring them back. And we've reduced this by destroying terrestrial herbivores by 92%. By anadromous fish or salmon, they would swim upstream and of course redistribute nutrients back upriver, reduced by 96%. And then the marine mammals, including whales, we reduced this by 77%. This biological pump. Okay, these are serious big time numbers. We're reducing this biological pump. Okay, this is what maintains the world the way it is. This is the state of the world. This is why we're heading for a very deprived world. Okay, so whales are valuable. They're invaluable to the world. This idea that they're only worth $2 million is ridiculous. Okay, problem 7. To put any dollar value and then to make it how valuable they are to us because we want to sightsee them. You have to understand why I get angry with the economic discipline. It's a joke. Okay, we are causing a massive extinction events and economists are clueless. Every one of these things are all in the red. This is 50%, right? Large predatory fish are disappearing, wetlands, 85% going, free-flowing rivers, on and on and on. Okay. This is recent research. This is just in January. 43% of tree species are at risk of extinction. This is 82% of Atlantic rainforest biome. 17,000 tree species are at risk of extinction. This is a different study using different methodology, but I imagine these are compatible numbers. 69% of African raptors risk extinction. 80% are in decline. It was also reported that 1,400 bird species have already gone extinct. That's 13% of the total. These are major mass extinction type numbers. This is not a trivial extinction event that we're causing, and we're only just beginning. And there's a lot of momentum into this thing. So even if we all decide today to grow a frontal cortex and be responsible, there would still be extinction. Problem 8, the goals of neoclassical economics are not compatible with human welfare. Neoclassical orthodox economics maximize consumerism, the flow of money, and GDP. To Friedman, you're not a father, a mother, a brother, a sister, a husband, a wife. You're not a soccer player. You're not you don't play the guitar. You're not a musician. You're none of that. You are a consumer unit. Your only value to the economy is if you consume. And it doesn't matter whether you need what you consume or what you consume or whether or not you can even afford it. That your value to the economy is as a consumer unit. And the other goal, of course, is to maximize private profit. If nobody's making money, then obviously it isn't productive. I mean, I've actually read things that they've written about like that. Biophysical or ecological heterodox economics is a total different front. And every human should have a decent life. We should have a democratic government. We should preserve the environment and resources for future generations and also for our co-evolved species. And of course, science and technology advances. These guys, one of them, a book we read, Martin Wolf, called basically a Luddite. He called Jason Hickel a Luddite. Well, Martin Wolf has no concept of science and technology, and he's calling Hickel a Luddite. And you know, if you read Hickel's book, he's perfectly aligned to science advances and technology. That's just an example. Okay, in any event, this is our energy footprint. This is final energy, and these are different countries. This is how much energy a human needs for a decent life. You can see there's plenty of humans that fall underneath this, plenty of humans that are consuming way too much and don't even have a decent life. A lot of these humans don't have a decent life. Capitalism is extremely inefficient. So, you know, I calculate total energy required for everybody to have a decent life is 128 exajoules per year. But the total primary energy we used in 2022 was actually 604 exajoules per year. So this is all waste. Mankiw writes, and that's the same Mankiw that I copped the circular flow model, that perpetual motion machine from. Efficiency means that society is getting the maximum benefit from scarce resources. They're not scarce. We're just abusing them and misusing them. Equity means that those benefits are distributed fairly. These two goals conflict. What's wrong with these economists? So clearly the human economy has the resources to meet both goals, but it's achieving neither. And again, capitalism is extremely inefficient. And yet they'll talk, rant on and on about how capitalism is the most efficient thing going. It's not. The evidence certainly doesn't support that. Okay, methodology of neoliberalism. Okay, this is from Milton Friedman. You can find so many quotes from this character. Truly important and significant hypotheses will be found to have assumptions that are wildly inaccurate descriptive representations of reality, and in general, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions. This is a logic violation. This is this is in methodology to positive economics. This is the methodology of neoliberalism and neoclassical. This is a logic violation. It's ex falso quod libet, from a false proposition, anything follows. And it's just simple. You want to show that, you know, capitalism, free markets, this is your ideal, this is your ideology, this is the greatest thing. So you go back and you make up any old assumptions you want to come with the conclusions you want to come to. And when he in 1952 he wrote a paper on firms, and everybody criticizes that his assumptions are invalid. He says it doesn't matter. I came to the right conclusions, the ones I wanted. The economist Paul Samuelson, the aforementioned guy with the perpetual motion machine, even he recognized that this is empirically dead wrong. And we don't do science this way. In science, your conclusions are only valid in the range and domain where your assumptions are valid. And we have plenty of examples of that in science and mathematics, where you do approximations, to simplify a problem when you're working in the back of the envelope in a restaurant. Well, whatever you conclude is only going to be valid assuming your assumptions are true, and only under those conditions. Here's some more Milton Friedman quotes. He's a wonderful guy. So we have 6 big problems. Ecological collapse, it is definitely happening. It's got a name, Holocene extinction. Climate change is definitely happening. And I showed last time, so I didn't, you missed this, but James Hansen came out with a paper in December, and basically he said it's a lot worse than the IPCC forecast in 2019. I think Hansen is right. But it remains to be seen. We have weapons of mass destruction. Humans are suffering, and this is important. Humans are suffering mass psychosis because we're totally oblivious to all this stuff. Neoclassical economists have the wrong model of the economy, which is physically impossible, and they are deciding policy. And they don't even know what they're doing. Capitalism is, again, encourages dishonesty. It rewards greed, promotes psychopaths, and requires exponential growth ad nauseum to function, which is impossible. Now, you might think that, oh, am I favoring some otherism? And I think that we'll talk. I'll talk about this in talk 6. But the fact of the matter is, capitalism is the dominant. I mean, if it was communism, I could ride herd on them too. It's not that capitalism is better or worse than anybody else. It's just that it's bad, and everybody else is probably equally bad. But we'll talk about that in part 6. Again, this is where we're heading. The fact that we have weapons of mass destruction makes this possible. The other 3 extinction events, which were caused by species, of course, moss, trees, and cyanobacteria didn't have weapons of mass destruction, so all they could do was cause a collapse and a dieback. And then everything recovered again. Okay, so there was less risk, but we can do this. But even a dieback means billions of people will die. So we definitely have to find a way to get from B to A. And that's the end. Sorry, took so long.